The opening chapter of the Bible says that every human being is made in the image of God. That means that every human life has inherent dignity. But what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What's involved? Why does it matter? In this video, we'll focus on two ideas, representation and character, to orient our thoughts on what it means to be made in the image of God. The image of God shows up first in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And this is a crucial part of this opening chapter of the Bible because the narrative here takes a sudden shift. The story slows down. Up until this point, we've got this almost monotonous, recurring language of, and God said, let there be, and there was. And God saw that it was good, evening, morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. Those repetitive elements come up again and again and again throughout the opening verses of the first chapter of Genesis. With chapter 1, verse 26, the narrative slows down. Instead of God saying, let there be, God pauses to deliberate on the next thing he's going to create. He says, let us make human beings in our image and let them have dominion over the birds and fish and animals, the creation as a whole by implication. So instead of just doing it, God pauses for a moment to deliberate on the purposes of human beings as he is about to create them. And then we learn two things about human beings. God says, let us make humankind, human beings in our image, and let them have dominion. The word dominion refers to authority. But in Genesis, it's not a dominating dictatorial authority. It is the authority of a steward, a trustee, a caretaker. We learn that as Genesis 2 develops these ideas to some degree, where Adam is responsible for naming the animals and caring for creation, working creation, producing, cultivating the garden, and by extension, the rest of the earth. Where does the idea of representation come from? Well, the notion of dominion carries the implication that human beings represent God. God is the ultimate authority. In him, all authority inheres. His authority and power is demonstrated in his creative power. He speaks and things happen. There's a certain authority that happens there. When he endows human beings with authority, they are in some way representing him. That being endowed with the image and the authority, the dominion that they're given, means that they are his representatives. This point of representation is substantiated if we think about the creation narrative in terms of ancient temples, and temples in the ancient world. If a civilization or culture created a temple, they would often put an image, a statue of the deity in the temple. And that statue wasn't simply kind of a portrait of the deity. It literally, mysteriously perhaps, but literally represented the presence of the deity in the temple. So when God takes human beings and puts them into the garden as a place of his presence, as his image, they're not just somehow a portrait of him, they are actually representing his presence in the creation. So one of the first things that we want to think about when we think about being made in the image of God is that human beings represent God. By bearing the image of God, human beings represent God. That brings us to the second point, character. If human beings are going to represent God faithfully, they must maintain and cultivate a certain character. There are objective standards for the way they conduct themselves. Human beings must conduct themselves in ways that honor God. And this shows up with the forbidden fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, doesn't it? God puts some boundaries around the tree. He demonstrates his benevolence, his kindness, his generosity. Here are millions of trees. Every tree in the world is yours, except the one God says, I'm keeping for myself. God says, don't eat the fruit from this tree. If you do, you'll die, right? And so human beings have this vocation that involves honoring God's commandments. It involves allowing their lives to be conformed to a standard that he has set, an objective standard that he has set. And as long as that is maintained, they represent him faithfully. They maintain relationship with him. They walk together in the garden, and they are faithful in the way they represent him. If that boundary gets transgressed, if they choose not to honor God with the way they conduct themselves, then that damages the relationship and it inhibits their ability to faithfully represent God, right? faithful representing God depends on embodying a character that honors God. And if human beings fail to embody a character that honors God, it doesn't mean we're not representing him, but it does mean we're not representing him faithfully. So when we think about how we appropriate this notion that we're made in the image of God in the present day, we need to be thinking about the fact that God has called human beings to represent him in this world, to carry his presence into all aspects of our life, whether it's our homes and our families, our marriages, whether it's our workplace. How do I, in the way I conduct myself, represent God amongst my coworkers, my colleagues, when I'm engaged in recreation? Am I representing God in a faithful way? And if we are, it means that we embody a certain character. It means that we are consistently honoring God in the way we conduct ourselves. And if we don't honor God in the way we conduct ourselves, it detracts. It means we undermine his reputation. It means that we are faithless in the way that we represent him instead of faithful in the way that we represent him. So let's keep these two things in mind. Everyone is made in the image of God, and that means that we represent him and that we represent him faithfully by embodying his character.